Kitco News coverage of FreedomFest is brought to you by Coin Payments, crypto payments made easy.
I'm Michelle Makori, and this is Kitco News here in Las Vegas from FreedomFest 2022. And I'm thrilled to now be joined by the host and organizer of FreedomFest, Mark Skousen. Mark, good to be back this year.
Yeah, it's great, Michelle. We're back in Vegas for the first time in 2 years because of the lockdown.
Yeah.
And we went to South Dakota last year and had a record crowd, and we have a record crowd here. So people are happy to be back in Vegas, the gambling capital of the world. And sometimes the markets seem like a gamble too, so It fit right in.
Well, you certainly have expertise to weigh on the markets. You're the editor of Forecast and Strategies. You're also a professor of economics at Chapman University. And one of your claims to fame is correctly calling the 1987 crash, also known as Black Monday.
Yeah, that was a long time ago, but it taught me an important lesson that the government now has tools to keep a crash from happening, or at least minimizing the chances. So I've never called a crash since then.
Okay.
But bear markets are very real, and we're in one right now. So that's just a good example of it. But crashes, the government can intervene. You can stop the markets from time to time. There's lots of methods that are used now to avoid a crash.
Do you think that those methods could be employed effectively to avoid what many are saying is an inevitable hard landing as the Fed continues to tighten? I mean, by some estimates, we already could be in a recession if second quarter GDP figures come in negative as expected. We'd technically be in a recession. Do you think that there's a way to still get a soft landing here?
Actually, my gross output statistic, the GO statistic, which measures spending at all stages of production, includes the supply chain. Remember, GDP does not include the supply chain. Of course, supply chain shortages have been a very big issue. My GO statistic is continuing to grow. That means the supply chain, despite these shortages, is continuing to grow. In fact, GO is up in real terms 3.9% in the first quarter. Now, we don't have second quarter data for GDP or GO. The GDP estimates by economists is that it will be negative, but I actually think that we're going to have a mild recession and maybe not a recession at all. Why? Because the markets are responding to the shortages. They are solving problems. Government creates problems. The markets solve problems. And that's what FreedomFest is all about. It's freedom, because freedom leads to prosperity, not to shortages, not to inflation and all the other problems that we're facing.
Well, before we go back to FreedomFest and the bigger theme here, I want you to elaborate on how you see this not turning out as bad as many people are expecting it to. When you say the markets are responding as they should be, what do you mean by that?
Well, the Fed is raising rates, but I don't think they're raising rates really dramatically. Yes, they raised at 75 basis points and so forth, but it's still way under the inflation rate, right? So you have negative real interest rates right now. Well, that's generally positive for the market. So there is a readjustment going on because we had this long 40-year bull market in stocks and bonds, and now we're suddenly having a bear market, especially in the bond market. But you have to remember that the economy is very dynamic now. Globalization is very real. We haven't abolished globalization. So markets are responding. We're still under the Trump tax cuts. We now have a 21% tax rate on corporate rates. That's the lowest rate we've had in 30 years. I think that's having an impact. Corporations are doing pretty well. Now, inflation is the problem, and inflation is caused by the Fed. But look what the Fed is doing. They're now bringing the monetary growth down to more reasonable levels, of 4 or 5%, as opposed to 25% the years before.
So you have faith that the Fed will be able to tame this inflation?
I do think the Fed, just like Paul Volcker, when he raised rates dramatically, in 1982, there was a Mexican debt crisis. The Fed reversed role, they injected liquidity, and the market never looked back. So that probably will happen. There may be
You think Powell will have the gumption to go for double-digit rate hikes? I mean, that's what Volcker did in order to get
Yeah,
inflation
but we're
down.
not in that kind of situation, because what you had in the 80s was a long-term inflationary psychology that had to be broken. We're just starting to reinflate, so I think it can be broken fairly easy. Not fairly easy, but certainly can be broken. And so I'm relatively optimistic. I'm also optimistic because the Republicans, I think, will win the House and the Senate in the United States, and that will create gridlock. Joe Biden will have to deal with the Republicans. If we get through November without a tax increase, that means the Trump tax cut will continue to exist for another 2 years.
Well, the IMF, by the way, agrees with you. They say that they do think inflation will be somewhat tamed by 2023.
Tempered, yeah.
Yeah, tempered by that. So you mentioned a red wave in November, and waves and tides are the big theme at this year's
Yes,
Freedom
true.
Fest, turning the tide. I'm assuming part of that includes a red wave. But why don't you explain the theme of turning the tide and what you've seen this year?
Yeah, so I think we've reached a turning point. Government spending as a percent of GDP, it's been the highest level ever. It just hit 50% in the United States. So we're half free and half slave, as Abraham Lincoln might say. Applying it to slavery, but I think you can apply it to the way we live and so forth. Because Milton Friedman was right. He said that government spending is the actual correct view, not the tax rate. But government spending as a percent of GDP means that we're 50% money's being spent by the government, including welfare. And we were excessively giving money away and so forth. This is what caused the inflation.
Right.
So I think we've reached our limit. We've had enough. It's time to reverse the tide.
Okay, well, we've reached our limit with time because you
Okay.
have another live hit.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining us.
All right, my
Short,
pleasure.
brief, but always informative.
And Michelle, next Freedom Fest will be in Memphis, Tennessee, July 12th through the 13th. So we're very
right.
excited about going there.
A fun location. Thank you,
Yeah.
Mark.
Thank you.
Kitco News coverage of Freedom Fest is brought to you by Coin Payments, crypto payments made easy.